Good morning. Thank you for joining us again for episode 3 of The Professor and the CEO with Rachel again. And we're delighted to have you with us because the whole idea behind this was about me giving real perspectives from a CEO who's going through a crisis and managing for a crisis, but also with the insights from Rachel and her profession of just good advice that businesses and employees and CEOs like myself can get from looking to that world for information and guidance. So that's a bit about me and why we're here again today. Rachel?
Hi, so just a reminder, or for those joining us today, my name is Rachel Doern and I'm a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship at Goldsmiths, which is part of the University of London, and my research and expertise relates to entrepreneurship in times of crisis. So I look at how entrepreneurs manage during times of crisis, how they detect vulnerabilities, how they prepare for such, how they can contain and limit or localize the effects of a crisis, how they can recover, and thinking about what they've learned from a crisis and how they can feed back through that learning through the cycle of events. And I also focus on resilience, which is about how to maintain a stable equilibrium during times of adversity. And I'll be talking about resilience and well-being quite a bit today, and then I'll go back to Ben to sort of gauge his response and how he's been faring in this regard. So I wanted to start by saying a few words about well-being. And well-being, just to keep everyone informed, is quite a difficult and complex concept to define. But perhaps before I go into that, just to remind everyone that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you do have any questions, be sure to write those questions in and we'll come back to you at the end of the session. And the session hopefully shouldn't last for more than around 30 minutes. So back to well-being. So it is a difficult concept to define, but we can also think about well-being or try to define it in part in relation to the notion of resilience. And resilience is really important during a crisis, and resilience is about the ability to bounce back following adversity. But resilience is more than that as well. It's also about maintaining a healthy functioning throughout adversity and in the longer term as well. And healthy functioning in turn is associated with two different kinds of well-being: psychological well-being and physical well-being. So if we think about psychological well-being, we're really talking about things like we're talking about one's ability to adapt to adversity or to weather life's little ups and downs, but it's also more than that. It's also about having a purpose. It's also about achieving mastery over certain situations. And it also tends to be associated with higher levels of positive affect, so moods and emotions, and lower levels of negative affect. And people who tend to report higher levels of psychological well-being also tend to report higher levels of life satisfaction more generally. So that's psychological well-being on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we have physical well-being. So physical well-being is all about the kinds of choices that we make in our lives around what to eat, how much sleep to get, how much exercise we can get. And it's also about abstaining from drink or drugs that alter mood or bodily processes. So just to move a little bit forward, there are a number of things that entrepreneurs can do now, I believe, based on the research, but also based on my discussions with individuals over the last few weeks, but also in the past, to manage their own well-being and to support the well-being of their staff. So I think one of the first things that we can all do as individuals, but entrepreneurs can do more especially, is that we can step back and take stock. So we can reflect on protective factors, and we can think about how can we build up additional resources for ourselves at this time. And I think this will enable people to better cope. And protective factors are really those strengths, those assets, those resources that serve to buffer against adversity and to mitigate the risks involved. And developmental psychologists were really among the first to talk about these kinds of protective factors decades ago, to try to understand why it was the case that some children and some young people, adolescents, who were affected by difficult circumstances responded very differently to those circumstances. So for instance, people who were victims of violence or abuse or faced certain socioeconomic disadvantages in growing up, or a catastrophic life situation or life event, or whose parents had mental illness. Why was it the case that some of those individuals actually went on to establish enduring and positive relationships and satisfying careers, and others did not? So what were the differences between these two different groups? So they attributed the differences to these protective factors at the individual level, at the group level, and also at the broader community or societal level. So I'm going to try to share my screen with you now to show you a particular diagram which relates to what I'm talking about. So this is the resiliency model, but even going back before that. So you can see how we have these protective factors at all these different levels. So for instance, at the internal level, at the individual level rather, you might have things like self-esteem or impulse control or a positive temperament or even persistence. That having these kinds of qualities or characteristics, again, can serve to buffer against adversity and to mitigate some of the risks involved. But then at the broader group or familial level, you have other factors as well, like access to responsive caregivers or a cohesive family unit. And then even at the next level, at the community or societal level, you might live in a safe neighborhood, which can also serve as a protective factor, or you might have access to positive peer groups or role models. So all of these things are important to individuals as we go through times of crisis that can serve to protect us. And if we take a look at this next slide, this resiliency model, you can see that when we encounter these kinds of stressors, these kinds of these different examples of adversity, that these protective factors kick in, and they may determine the pathways that people ultimately take, whether or not individuals are relatively unscathed by the interruptions. You can see that some people might reintegrate to a comfort zone. Other people might go on to even further develop and grow and change the way they think and the way they behave for the better. And then other people might be less well off. Let's say they don't have as many of these protective factors in place. So they might reintegrate in a dysfunctional capacities. They might take to drink or drugs or self-harming, or they might integrate with some losses incurred. And we can apply this to organizations as well. So I think really taking stock of these protective factors that we all may or may not have access to, and investing in further resources can help us be more resilient. And I think also for entrepreneurs going through times of difficulty, times of crisis, we can think about what kinds of protective factors those individuals have in place. So for instance, entrepreneurs may have a sense of entrepreneurial, what we refer to as a sense of entrepreneurial self-efficacy. So to what extent do individuals believe that they are able to carry out the tasks of an entrepreneur, that they are able to develop business opportunities and exploit them in relation to the business, that they are able to assemble the kinds of resources that people need within their businesses, whether they be people or money, and to manage those resources in turn. So entrepreneurial self-efficacy is really important at the individual level during times of crisis. At the more group, let's say, or organizational level, we might have things like a protective factor might be working in a place that has open and flexible systems and processes, as opposed to a place where everything is really rigid and hierarchical. So that can also be an advantage or a protective factor. Other things might include having access to a strong and positive organizational team, having access at the broader community or societal level, having access to a supportive community, having access to business associations, councils, government funding. All of these things serve as protective factors for individual entrepreneurs and their businesses. So I think that's really important. And finally, before I bring Ben in and engage his response and his experiences in relation to some of these issues, some of these factors, I wanted to say a few words about entrepreneurs and how they can manage or help manage or enhance the well-being of their employees during this time. And Ben and I were discussing this before, but I think one of the key things that individuals and organizations can do now is to give people information. I think being transparent is super important at this time. So there's so much uncertainty right now and volatility in the environment. And uncertainty, as I've mentioned before, really exists where there's a gap between the information we need and the information we have access to. So even if the information is not necessarily positive or helpful in some ways, I still think keeping people up to date as to what's happening with the business and what recovery is looking like is important, because it can enable these people to plan accordingly. So that's important, providing information, but also giving staff a greater sense of control over their own work. So involving people in the recovery process, involving people in decisions around how social distancing will actually manifest over the next few weeks or months or even years, perhaps. So these are the people who will implement those practices. These are the people who will be most affected by those practices. So I think it makes sense to involve them in those processes and to get their perspective on such. And I think other things that entrepreneurs and their businesses can do for employees at this time include being a role model or facilitating peer-to-peer connections and support, but also providing people with training, providing them with the training and the tools that they need to carry out their jobs. So that's incredibly important, and creating a sense of cohesiveness within the organization. So I have many other things that I want to talk about as well, but I'd like to pause here and solicit some feedback, and in particular some insights from Ben's perspective as to what's made it easier for him.
It's really interesting because seeing it displayed like that was new for me, and thinking about it in such a strategical way, but stepping back and saying I need to put protective factors in place to actually to help with my resilience, and almost plan for those dips in resilience for later on. So, I mean, reflecting on the business side, I mean, what we really focused on straight away was we knew it was going to be a roller coaster for staff. We could tell that there was going to be an emotional roller coaster with being cut off from the community of the office and being cut off from their colleagues and of course the wider community. We knew that it was going to be a roller coaster in terms of worries about health, a roller coaster in terms of worries about finances, and also just a roller coaster of sort of doing something new. So we really focused upon how we could put a wrapper around the individual and also recreate the community aspect of the business. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what were the appropriate social media channels, the appropriate sort of groups that we could set up to sort of pique people's interest, and give them perhaps new activities that were completely outside of work and were an escape from work, but a way of having community and having really locked in. And then when it came to sort of the individual around work and around concerns they would have, we really focused upon keeping as much of the status quo we had in the business as possible. So those who were going through coaching or training, it was the encouragement to maintain that, to feel free to talk about that. For those who were on furlough, it was, well, we need to give you training schemes that keep your self-confidence in your skill set, and so you don't start worrying that you're being out of the company or out of the market for a period of time that you might fall over. So we really focused on that in the business. For myself, to be honest, I've been useless at it. I've been absolutely terrible at stepping back and thinking about how to protect myself. And if I looked over the period of lockdown, at the beginning, actually subconsciously, I was doing quite well in that I was making sure I was getting out of the house, getting out of the room in which I was working, not just looking at the same four walls, doing some exercise, like focusing on other things. And as lockdown's gone on, I suppose there's been sort of pressure points in the business around decision making and strategy and business development. Actually, if I look at it, I sort of locked myself into probably a mentality of not leaving the four walls and cutting myself off from family, from community, and even my own individual protections, which, you know, probably hasn't had, well, it's definitely gonna have a negative impact, whether that's like now or whether it's in the future, I'm sure. So it's sort of encouraging me to break out from that and put some of these protective factors in place, or at least recognize them.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add that some of my research on crises and entrepreneurship in the past has found that when you have an abundance of resources in one area, let's say you have a lot of inner strength and determination and or community support, that can also serve in some cases to supplement for deficiencies in other areas, like let's say a lack of funding. So for instance, one of the individual entrepreneurs that I've been speaking to over the last few weeks, he's fallen through all the cracks. So in terms of government funding, so he's ineligible for government funding, and he's got a lot of expenses and those are increasing. And that's very difficult for him. But instead of sitting back and doing nothing as a result, you know, he's kind of relying on himself and relying on the support of his community as well. So I think that's really important. But there is a cautionary tale here that sometimes investing in resources can take time and energy, and not all of those investments will pay out necessarily. But I still think it's worthwhile to invest in those endeavors. Okay, I wanted to say a few words as well about other things that people can do to protect their well-being and well-being of their staff over the next little while. And another thing is eliciting and harnessing positive emotions. So I think this is really important, and positive emotions are important, especially in times of crisis, to the extent that they can counter or turn down the volume on negative emotions. So there's a lot of negative emotions around right now. So a lot of us are experiencing frustration, as you mentioned, exhaustion. People are experiencing a lot of anxiety and worry over what's coming next in relation to the future. And I think negative emotions can be useful, especially in the short term, because they alert us to a problem. So they turn our attention and energy towards that problem and trying to resolve such. But the problem is when negative emotions persist over the long term, then it can lead to depression and burnout and these other things. So it's really important, I think, to try to develop as far as possible positive emotions. It's not to say that positive emotions are always positive, because they can signal to people that, hey, everything's fine. It can lead to complacency. But in times of crisis, they're especially important because it can, from an entrepreneurial perspective, increase one's alertness to new opportunities. It can enhance creative thinking, and it can enhance people's access to more strategies within their repertoire, and it can also attract resources to individuals and businesses. So I think eliciting these kinds of positive emotions are important, and I think people are experiencing, to an extent, a sense of hope around what's coming next. So we all hope that infection rates will go down and life will return to normal. And some entrepreneurs are experiencing a sense of excitement in relation to how they can maybe diversify their offering or pivot or create new businesses. And there are several different strategies we can use to elicit and harness these positive emotions. So psychologists talk about benefit finding. So for instance, if we think about the current pandemic, we can imagine, even though there are a lot of negatives, is there anything positive that's come out of this? Can you see any value for you as an individual or your business in relation to how you work, or the nature of work that you engage in, or the kinds of opportunities that you might want to pursue? So that's benefit finding. And benefit reminding is also stepping back and reflecting and thinking about the positives you already have. So why did you become an entrepreneur in the first place? What are the benefits, the perks in relation to such? Or the benefits, reminding yourself of all the support that you've received from your team, from external parties, and all of the support maybe you've given to other people. So that's benefit reminding. And then there's also using humor. And I think humor is incredibly important and another way to elicit positive emotions. So this is about seeing what's funny about something, making light of the issues or the situation. So not about the pandemic per se, because of course there are a lot of negatives, but maybe just in the little daily interactions or things that are going on. Like for instance, I was in the kitchen the other day with my partner and we were having lunch, and I was slicing a cooked ham. And instead of saying he thought the ham was delicious, he said the ham was approachable. So he found it was approachable. And I thought, in an era of social distancing, that's quite a funny way to describe food. Maybe we've been isolating for too long now. So, and this kind of amused me for the rest of the day. So I think hanging on to these little things can be quite important. And another thing that we can do is strive for positive adaptation. So positive adaptation is all about taking an active response to problem solving as opposed to a passive one. A passive response is more associated with negative adaptation. So it's about seeing what are the issues, what are the challenges at the forefront, and how can we resolve them? And if possible, to do so relatively quickly. Not that we're making decisions very quickly, but that we're still taking action. So again, going back to the entrepreneur that I mentioned, who's not eligible for support, he's doing many things. So he's connecting with other people in his community. He's also lobbying for support from the government, striving for changes in legislation, and he created a GoFundMe campaign. So he's not sitting idle. He's not engaged in negative adaptation, which is more about alienation and isolation. So he's doing all of these things, which I think is important. And my research on entrepreneurship in crises has shown that positive adaptation can, over time, create these new ways of thinking, these new behaviors, can lead to personal and professional growth, and can also lead people to become more engaged with their businesses over time as opposed to less engaged. And especially important for now, it's also positive adaptation gives people the energy and the motivation to carry on, which I think is essential. And I just wanted to mention one other thing about well-being, which is, as Ben alluded to, taking time out for self-care. I can't stress this enough. So this is so important. And Ben and I have been discussing this outside of this platform as well. Although difficult, I think entrepreneurs more now than ever before should be encouraged to take breaks, to eat well, to maintain their fitness levels, and to engage in other activities that bring them pleasure, because their resources, your resources, Ben, ultimately are being depleted. And if anything, you need to replenish those resources by taking long weekends, by taking a holiday, by doing all of these things. Because if not for yourself and for your family, for your businesses, you're running on fumes. You cannot give your whole self to your business if your energy reserves are depleted. And I think entrepreneurs really need to ensure that their staff including those working remotely, also have time for self-care, that they also have time for breaks, that they're not expected to be working 24/7, and they have time for holidays as well. So I think all of these things are really essential. I don't know, Ben, if you have any thoughts or comments in relation to any of those ideas.
There's so much there, and so much gold, to be honest. Can I just go, Rachel, at the start, was the idea that almost you embrace the negativity to almost like hone your skills to turn that into positive outcomes? Was that where you were going with the sort of positive adaptation?
So sorry, can you say that again? So in terms of
when you started before, it was almost that an entrepreneur can almost embrace the negative thoughts and the negative situation that's going on, and that almost like piques the abilities they have, prompts them, and that they can turn that into a positive adaptation. Was that
or to see the value? So going back to the negative versus positive emotions, to see the value maybe in the difficult times, or what's coming out of it, the positives that are coming out of it. But I think negative adaptation more generally which is associated with passive responses to difficulties, doing nothing. So I've had people say to me, I'm just waiting, I'm doing nothing. And I had this during my previous research on crises as well. Or there's support available, but I'm not taking advantage of the support because that's not me. I don't ask for handouts. And I think that's an issue for some, and I think that's problematic. So I think we find that positive adaptation, being active, taking advantage of what's available, building new resources and new strategies is more likely to carry people through these difficult times.
I mean, definitely in terms of the benefit finding. Yeah, I would say like our business has achieved in 3 months what we probably would have expected to achieve in 2 or 3 years in terms of the way we've thought about business development, about the products we're taking to market, new products we need to bring to market, strategizing and analyzing what market we're going to go into. To us, even just dealing with some issues where we just kept kicking the can down the road, just in terms of like our structure, our management, our communication with each other, how we were reporting some of the inefficiencies within the business. I've definitely found it's been invigorating actually to just really streamline the business and communicate well. And it's always the crisis takes out in a good way, takes out almost the human sensitivity. That you're like, hey, we're in crisis now. I'm not going to worry about your feelings as much as I would typically. This is a problem. We've got to deal with it. So that's been really useful for the business. But you wouldn't want that to be your status quo. You wouldn't want to completely forget about human emotions and dealing with people like in a sensitive and empathetic way. So we've definitely found a lot of benefits, and I've been really grateful for them. Definitely so. And I agree that for us, I mean, me personally speaking, the thought of doing nothing, of being passive, would never fly with me anyway. I probably respond and work better in sort of crisis style, in sort of a conflict style than in a peacetime style. So I would say to anyone who's like listening in, like this is a great time to be like proactive and to put things to the test. And yeah, definitely don't embrace being passive at all.
Thank you. And I also wanted to say a few words now about the new kinds of demands that are being placed on entrepreneurs in particular and their businesses as it relates to the leadership activities they might be engaging with over the last little while and what's to come. And I think, going back to the notion of entrepreneurial self-efficacy and how people think about themselves as entrepreneurs and what they believe they can do, that we know entrepreneurs are charged with a number of tasks, which do include some of the things I mentioned before, like seeking out opportunities, making decisions, creating new directions for their businesses, assembling resources, managing resources, all of these things. They're also charged with managing internal and external communications and so on and so forth. But I'm seeing now that over the last few weeks that a lot of people are talking about these new responsibilities that they feel they have in relation to protecting the well-being of their staff in terms of increasing morale, creating a greater sense of cohesion, all of these things. So they feel this intense or heightened responsibility to engage in those kinds of activities. And they're doing this in different ways. So people are trying to connect with their employees one-to-one or via group meetings, or arranging social events, or checking in on them, those who are having difficulties, or even those who are furloughed, as you mentioned. So whether they be working remotely or on furlough, sort of making sure that everybody's okay. So that's been a big thing for a lot of individuals. And then it made me think about, in general, the leadership styles that we often associate with businesses. And these styles might take on the form of task leadership or more relational, or what we refer to as socio-emotional leadership. So a task leader is someone who's more, say, externally focused, someone who's focused on achieving goals within an organization and mobilizing their staff to achieve those goals and providing them with direction and responses and answers in regards to such. Whereas a more relational or socio-emotional leader is someone who's more inward focused, more focused on interpersonal relations between staff, and more expressive perhaps in their orientation. And both roles are important. Both leadership roles are important, because a task leader is someone who enhances, or so research suggests, group efficacy. So the ability of a team to believe they can achieve their goals. It can also increase performance levels generally. But a socio-emotional leader is also important because it can increase cohesion within a team. And the interesting thing is that individuals generally don't tend to exhibit both kinds of leadership roles at the same time, because the energies and responsibilities associated with one take away from the energies and responsibilities invested in another. But teams that tend to have these two individuals in place, these two different kinds of leaders, are also the most successful. But what I'm seeing now, I'm not sure if it's that people are swapping from one leadership style to another, or if it's that both in general do deal with empathy or can manage empathy. So I think empathy right now is a key word. It's, showing your staff that you understand or empathize with their situation, trying to put yourself in their shoes. So a lot of people are struggling with carrying responsibilities and managing those on top of balancing their workloads. Some people are away from friends and family members, or isolated from those individuals. So people are struggling and empathizing with those situations. And empathy in turn is also associated with perspective taking. So seeing the merit in someone else's point of view can also help not only individuals, but also organizations to solve problems. So seeing that your staff have something to contribute, something to add to what's going on. And I think in turn, this kind of empathy building will lead a lot of organizations to create more enduring and positive and committed relationships with their staff members. So I think that's really valuable. But there are benefits and there are costs to this kind of increased sense of attachment to staff and this kind of empathy building within an organization. So the benefit is that people can see what they're made of in terms of compassion. They can see themselves as more compassionate leaders, and they can also find a sense of camaraderie in their team. So I think that's really valuable, and again, increased cohesion. But on the downside, it can take a lot of time and energy. So it can take time away from other tasks in relation to business planning, and it can deplete one's own energy reserves if you're continually worried and stressed about the well-being of your staff. And I think owner managers need to find a balance between the two. And I don't have any clear answers as to what the best strategy is. I think it depends on the individual and the business, but just some things to be mindful of. So I don't know, Ben, if you have any comments in relation to your own.
I think and I'm sure some of my team are watching this, so I'm sure I'll get the feedback if I'm wrong afterwards. But I think I've always been quite alive to the need for both skill sets, and I think I do have the ability to jump between two. But I'm certainly more. I always say I'm more of a Pentecostal pastor style leader than I am a university professor. Like the task side, I can do, but it's better done by others. So if we looked at our sort of core leadership team, the C-suite team, the other members of the team are definitely more task-based leaders. And I'm more of the social empathetic leader who's trying to drive up vision and energy and passion towards the business. So I think that works well. I think organizations need both, and organizations need to be aware of both. I think the people piece is really interesting. I think if you went and interviewed most CEOs before COVID-19 and said, as a business, what's your most valuable asset? They would say their people. And I wonder during this crisis, how many of them have truly focused upon their most valuable asset? I would imagine most CEOs have been head down in finances and structures and so on and so forth. And I think that's a catastrophic mistake. You have to keep that focus upon people throughout a crisis, just as you would if they were in the office. So I think it's actually something we've done really well as a business, is saying we have to look after our people. We have to make sure that they are mentally in a good place, physically in a good place. connected to the business, communicated with well, and also match fit for when they come back into everyday life. So we've really focused on that. I suppose for me, the change has been, we're a business that most of the time, at least once a week, we're in the office together and we have team meetings in the office together. And obviously that dynamic is very different because you can feed off of each other. You can feed off of each other's energy. Whereas all of a sudden we've had to change the way we communicate, and certainly how I communicate, to broadcast, where there's no necessarily like instant feedback coming from people. It's just me talking at people. And that's been a challenge. Like, it's been a challenge for me to really think about the message I've got, to really be as clear, as concise, and as transparent as possible. Because what I've come to realize is that naturally, as soon as I finish talking, people note what I say in a way that they wouldn't if we were in the office. There's a sense, if I say something's going to happen in this week, when I do it in broadcast, people expect it to happen that week. Whereas if I say it in the office, because there's so much going on, people aren't so fixed upon dates and on exact points. So it's really had to focus my mind to communicate well with the leadership team and the management team, so that when we put messages out to the staff, it's messages that they can rely on, that informs them, and actually it's something that can give them certainty in what is a very uncertain period.
Thank you. And I'm conscious of the time, but I just wanted to go through maybe a couple of the questions just very quickly. One question is to you, Ben. Is there anything, and I think you mentioned.
Yeah, I was reflecting on this morning, and the active staff particularly, and the management team particularly, with hindsight, I would have made sure that we were on a holiday rotation, that everyone was having a break during this period of time. I feel like everyone has gone into this sort of like war mode. We're in the trenches, war effort mentality, which is great, but sometimes you need relief from the front line. And certainly with myself and with the wider management team and everyone active, we've not done that well enough. So that's something really that I need to implement in the next few weeks.
And there was another question about individual and organizational resilience, and if you can have one without the other. And personally, I believe that you have to have both, especially in small businesses, but really all businesses, because if your team is, as I mentioned, is depleted, if you yourself as an individual owner, manager, or entrepreneur, you don't feel that you have the ability to make good decisions, to move forward in a positive way, then it doesn't matter really if your organization has flexible and a flat organizational structure or processes or systems. You're the one who has to sort of make those decisions and bring your business forward. So I think that's really important. And at the same time, you could be a resilient individual and you could be very capable, but you could be limited by the structure of your organization, and you could be limited by the external support available now. But as I mentioned before, it's useful to keep in mind that, again, these resources can be shifted around or used to compensate. But absolutely, it's a great question, and I do think that the two work together, that individual and organizational resilience are both extremely important. So I think that unfortunately, and sorry for the brevity of my response, but in the interest of time, that we'll have to stop there. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending and for your questions. And if you have any feedback, please put some comments into the ThirdWay LinkedIn space. That would be really useful for us. And I hope you can join us again in the future. So goodbye from me, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.